Hello everyone! This lesson uses a criminal trial to explain the basic concept of hypothesis testing and some important terms in a simplified way. And hello again to this lesson, which is for absolute beginners and provides an easy introduction to the basic concepts and terminology of hypothesis testing. These are explained using the analogy of a criminal trial. I covered more advanced aspects of hypothesis testing in other lessons. This lesson here, however, has two main learning objectives. First, in the end, based on the analogy of a criminal trial, you should have understood the basic concept of hypothesis tests and also know some essential terms. Furthermore, you should know which errors can occur when evaluating hypotheses and precisely what type 1 and type 2 errors mean. This lesson is divided into two chapters. The first chapter explains the basic concept of hypothesis tests using the analogy of a criminal trial. In the second chapter, this example is continued and the type 1 and type 2 errors are explained. Let's start with the basics of hypothesis tests, hopefully explained in an understandable way using the analogy of a criminal trial. In a criminal trial, allegations are made to a judge and jury. These claims are hypotheses. The prosecutor alleges that the accused committed a criminal offense. The accused claims he's innocent. Both claims are hypotheses to be tested. The principle of the presumption of innocence now applies in court. A person is innocent until proven guilty. This is the general accepted status quo. The defendant's claim that he is innocent becomes the null hypothesis. The prosecutor is now trying to reject this hypothesis. So, if the claim, "I'm innocent," is the null hypothesis, then the prosecutor presents an alternative to that null hypothesis, namely the claim that the accused is guilty. The assertion that the accused is guilty is thus the alternative hypothesis to the null hypothesis of the presumption of innocence. The prosecutor is now responsible for presenting sufficiently convincing evidence that an objective observer, such as the judge or jury, can reasonably conclude that the accused has committed the crime with reasonable certainty. Let's look at all of this in a little more detail. Again, based on the principle that everyone is innocent until proven guilty, we have the presumption of innocence on the left and the claim of guilt on the right. As already explained, the presumption of innocence, as the status quo, is the null hypothesis. Therefore, it is abbreviated with H0. On the other hand, we consequently have the alternative hypothesis, abbreviated H1 or HA. Both hypotheses are mutually exclusive. The verdict can be either guilty or not guilty, but not both. Anyone who claims anything that deviates from the current accepted status is also responsible for providing sufficient evidence to support this claim. Again, the evidence must be sufficiently convincing for an objective observer, such as the judge or jury, to reasonably conclude that the defendant has almost certainly committed the crime. Moreover, this conclusion must have a very high degree of certainty. At this point, a small reference to the requirements for rejecting a null hypothesis in statistics. In court, the accuser has to prove that his allegation is more true than false. For a guilty verdict, guilt must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. In statistics, it is defined in advance how strong the evidence against the null hypothesis must be before it is rejected and the alternative hypothesis is accepted. The value or evidence calculated here is, for example, the so-called p-value. In statistics, the error probability or significance level defines the strength of the evidence required. A typical value for the error probability is 5%. This means that the probability of rejecting a true null hypothesis is 5%. This would mean a 5% or less chance of an innocent person being found guilty in court. You can find out more about this in the other lessons. Now let's look at the other case. If the prosecutor fails to present sufficient evidence of guilt, the presumption of innocence continues to apply. Consequently, the verdict is not guilty. So the prosecutor failed to reject the null hypothesis of the presumption of innocence. Now let's look at the other case. If the prosecutor fails to present sufficient evidence of guilt, the presumption of innocence continues to apply. Consequently, the verdict is not guilty. So the prosecutor failed to reject the null hypothesis of the presumption of innocence. Attention! Here comes another critical point that needs to be understood. A not guilty verdict does not prove the accused's innocence. The defendant could theoretically be guilty, but the evidence was not strong enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. As with any trial, misjudgments can always occur. This is also the case when testing hypotheses with the help of statistics. These are referred to as type 1 and type 2 errors. Now let's see what that is exactly. Again, using our example of a criminal trial, we have the null hypothesis of innocence on the left and the alternative hypothesis of guilt on the right. Only this time we assume that the null hypothesis is true and that the defendant is innocent. Another time we believe that the alternative hypothesis is true and that the defendant is indeed guilty. Now, what can go wrong? The first possibility is that the verdict is not guilty. The prosecutor has, therefore, failed to reject the innocence claim of the accused, that is, to reject the null hypothesis. So, the verdict is correct. The other possibility is a misjudgment, namely when the accused is found guilty even though he is innocent. Thus, the prosecutor has falsely rejected the claim of innocence and the null hypothesis. So he was wrongly successful. This is what we call a type 1 error. Next, let's assume that the alternative hypothesis is true and that the defendant is indeed guilty. If the verdict is guilty, the prosecutor has correctly rejected the claim of innocence. The correct judgment was made. Again, a misjudgment can occur here, namely when the accused is actually guilty, but the verdict is not guilty. The prosecutor has therefore failed to reject the null hypothesis of innocence. We call that a type 2 error. So that's a lot of information. Therefore, I will summarize the 5 most important key messages again. A hypothesis is a premise or a claim that we want to test. The null hypothesis is assumed to be correct until the alternative seems more likely. The one who challenges the null hypothesis formulates an alternative hypothesis. A type 1 error is when the null hypothesis is correct but rejected. So the alternative hypothesis was wrongly accepted. A type 2 error is when the alternative hypothesis is correct but is wrongly rejected. If you found this lesson helpful, please let me know and leave a comment. Thank you for that, take care and see you next time. Bye!